Let's take an early look at the Citation 5 jet crash. This is the jet that flew over Washington, D.C., and some F-16s were scrambled to intercept it. It later crashed in Virginia, and 4 people aboard were killed, a single pilot and 3 people in the back. It's a curious profile on the aircraft. We know that it took off out of Elizabethton, and it climbed up to flight level 340 where it leveled off. It cruised at flight level 340 for the rest of the flight until it started a descent into its crash. The jet headed up to Long Island MacArthur Airport, which was its destination. But upon reaching that, it stayed at flight level 340 and then made an almost 180-degree turn to the left and headed back to its origin, Elizabethton. So what caused the crash? Let's take a look at the pilot. He was a 69-year-old pilot, a retired Southwest Airlines pilot. He flew on a Class 1 medical, and he was ATP rated, the highest rating that pilots can get in their career. He had just recently passed his Class 1 in October of 2022. The equipment, the Citation 5 is a reliable jet. The Citation Jet class has an exceptional safety record, and the Citation 5 is also a safe aircraft. This one was manufactured in 1990. And then finally, if we look at the conditions, they don't seem like they will be a factor in this accident. Either the weather or the winds or the temperature do not seem likely to be a factor. So what happened? First of all, the route of flight. Why did the route of flight go up to MacArthur and then turn around and come back to the destination, all at flight level 340? It seems like this is likely some kind of default mode in the autopilot. So let's track the pilot off. We can hear from transmissions from air traffic control that air traffic control is talking to the pilot after his departure out of Elizabethton. He calls center to pick up his clearance. He's cleared as filed, and then we can see that he's got a couple intermediate altitudes, one of which is he levels off at 340, even though he filed at 390. So that tells us he likely programmed that inside his autopilot from a clearance that he got somewhere along the line. We lose track of the communications, and we really don't hear anything more until we're hearing the communications on guard and the intercept communications that come later. So this tells us that it seems like the pilot was certainly conscious up until the part of the climb where he entered 340 into his final altitude, even though he filed for 390. He'll cruise at that altitude for a substantial amount of time, and then there's no attempt to descend for the approach into Long Island MacArthur Airport. The aircraft stays at 340 and turns around and heads back to Elizabethton. That seems to indicate the pilot is unconscious. We know the pilot is unconscious at some point because the intercepting pilots report visually seeing the pilot inside the Citation 5 and slumped over to the right. We don't know about the passengers in the back and what their status is. So what may have caused this accident? It looks like there are 2 likely factors that are suspicious here. The first is hypoxia. Hypoxia happens when you don't have enough oxygen and enough oxygen to feed the brain. And what will eventually happen is if you're oxygen deficient, you will fall into a state of unconsciousness. Certainly the pilot was unresponsive at some point, and so hypoxia is suspicious, and specifically insidious hypoxia. So these aircraft have pressurization systems that maintain a pressurization inside the aircraft at about 8,000 to 9,000 feet, no matter how high the aircraft goes. So in this case, it could go up to its ceiling into the 40,000 feet-ish or higher, and it would maintain a cabin altitude of 8,000 to 9,000 feet if it's working correctly. If it's not working correctly, that cabin altitude will just creep up and maintain something similar to the outside altitude of the airplane. If that happens on climb out and the pilot doesn't catch it, the insidious nature of that can be that you begin getting hypoxia symptoms, and you don't catch it. And if you don't see the systems inside your airplane, or you don't pick up on your hypoxia, you could fall into a state of unconsciousness. That seems a possibility here, In the cases where we've seen this happen, where it starts with a problem on the ground, it will happen about 20 minutes into the flight, and that seems to be where the FAA says, according to media reports, they lost communications with the pilot. So there are certainly some clues that seem to indicate an insidious hypoxic event happened, which could have been caused by a pressurization problem on the aircraft. The second type of depressurization event, the ones that are more dramatic that you see in Hollywood movies, are the rapid decompression. Those are also rare, but quite frankly, all of these scenarios are rare. Under a rapid decompression, a pilot at flight level 350 in that range will have somewhere between 30 to 60 seconds to put on their mask before they lose consciousness. It's a concept called time of useful consciousness. So under that scenario, your time of useful consciousness is 30 to 60 seconds. The pilot would need to reach over, grab the mask, and don it quickly. Now, that's something pilots go through. They're trained to do that. It comes as part of the type rating for these kinds of aircraft. So that would have been very familiar to this pilot, especially given his background and his experience. So that's the second potential for a hypoxic scenario. And then another possibility of this accident could be pilot medical issue of some type. So perhaps sometime on climb out, the pilot became unconscious due to some kind of medical issue. Now, this seems unlikely given just in October he passed a Class 1 medical, which is the highest rating of medical that pilots can get. But again, it's a possibility. Hopefully the NTSB can sort out what seemed to be the cause of this accident. We think that the unconsciousness happened on climb out just because of the profile that the aircraft flies up to. The autopilot would have flown it up to the 340 altitude and flown it from there until the crash. We can see the crash as it starts. The aircraft is obviously on autopilot, and it begins a right-hand turn, which goes into an aggressive spiral. If the aircraft ran out of fuel and the right engine flamed out first, and the aircraft's on autopilot, that would have caused that turn, and then eventually the autopilot would have kicked off and caused the careening into the forest floor. So that seems a potential way that eventually the aircraft crashes. It seems like fuel starvation. It ran out of fuel at some point. Finally, the question on the Intercept and why the Intercept was launched to find this pilot. When the aircraft went up to MacArthur and did the turn back southbound, almost a 180-degree turn, that put it almost on a direct line to the White House. That would have certainly got the attention of the NORAD and the other national authorities, and that's about the time where they launched the interceptors to go find the aircraft. So what can we learn from general aviation pilots from this mishap, regardless of what the NTSB finds? The first is to make sure we understand our cabin pressurization systems, how they operate, and what the indicators are of whether or not they're operating correctly. And then to make sure we reinforce on our procedures that we're checking the proper schedule, both on start, on takeoff, on climb out, and at cruise. If we wait until cruise to check in the cabin pressurization, it could be too late. The second is to make sure that we know our hypoxic symptoms, our symptoms for hypoxia. They can differ for each person. If you've not had the opportunity to go through an altitude chamber, I strongly recommend you do that so that you can get the sense of hypoxia and pick up the symptoms for yourself. And then if you ever see those symptoms, to know immediately your first response is to put on the oxygen and then figure out whether or not the symptoms are there or valid. And then finally, to remind ourselves of the rules on wearing oxygen masks. If you're single pilot above flight level 350, you're required to wear an oxygen mask. If you have more than one pilot, then above flight level 410, you wear the oxygen mask, or at least one pilot has to be on the oxygen mask if they're the quick donning type, which most masks are these days. In this case, it wouldn't have factored. The pilot looks like he was unconscious before he got to that altitude, but it's just a reminder to make sure we're recognizing the importance of wearing the mask when it's required. We'll keep you posted as we learn more of this tragedy. Thanks for supporting AOPA and thanks for watching.